a provocative statement. I would say that the place of that red meat has a place in healthy and sustainable diets. Now, nowadays it has become a provocative statement. I could not have told this to my grandparents. They would not have understood. It is almost surreal to say so in some ways. But then again, I am Belgian, and we're in the epicenter of surrealism. This is a painting by a Belgian surrealist painter, René Magritte. Maybe you have seen this one before. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. Now I will transfigure this one for you today into the following. Ceci ne sont pas des aliments. These are not foods. So, let's take one of those. This, an egg, is still to most people food. And I suppose that most people would still say that this is quality food. It contains quality protein, and it's packed with micronutrients. It's very interesting foodstuff. And yet, to some, the future of food looks like this. This is egg. It's also egg. It's made by the company Just. And if you read the small letters on this bottle, you will see that it's cholesterol-free, but it's also egg-free. So this, ladies and gentlemen, this is a egg-free egg. And it's also made from plants. Now, I put the list of ingredients next to it. You will not see a lot of plants. You will certainly not see fruits and vegetables. You will see mostly water, protein isolate, refined oils, and a long list of additives. This is also food, still, to most people. And again, some would argue that the future of food looks like this. Now, this list of ingredients is very similar to the one before. It is mostly water. It is also protein isolate, refined oils, and again, lots of emulsifiers, preservatives, things to mimic a very complex matrix. Now, you have to mimic something extremely complex, and you need a lot of technology to do so. Now, you could say this is the future of food only to a minority. We don't really have to mind it all that much. It's just a couple of people, and soon it will pass, and it's just one of those things that food industry comes up with. But this narrative is starting to cross a certain line, which I find quite concerning. Now, I'll present you here to a tweet from the official account of UN Environment. I'll read it to you. So I'll read that to you. So, warning, no meat was used in the following video. Cutting back on meat is an essential part of preventing the degradation of our environment. And then the most worrisome part, mainstreaming meatless burgers benefit businesses, consumers, and our planet. Now, it has a little video that goes with this. And in the video, you see that in 2018, UN Environment has declared impossible foods and Beyond Meat as champions of the earth. Now, we've just seen Beyond Meat. That was the burger I just showed you before. Impossible Foods is a similar company. And this company has also as a goal to eliminate the need for animals in the food chain by 2035. So let this sink in for a minute. We have an official account of the United Nations promoting ultra-processed foods and an extreme agenda. At this point, I would like to introduce you to something that is called the pharmacon. I think it's a useful concept to look at this problem. The pharmacon is a philosophical idea that has been used by Jacques Derrida in the previous century and goes all the way back to Plato. Now, a pharmacon is a substance that is both beneficial and harmful. So it's something that is at the same time a cure and a poison. And you see that also in the concept of pharmacy, in the word pharmacy. The pharmacy sells medicine, which is at the same time a bit of poison. See where it's coming from? And I would say that meat is a perfect example of the pharmacon. And that is because it's one side of society would refer to meat as something nourishing. That's a long-standing connotation. It offers you strength, vitality, nutrients. And at the same time, another narrative would state that it causes cancer, it will kill you, and all sorts of things. Now, the pharmacon concept has been used in philosophy to expose Western thinking for being binary and reductionist. And you have this tension here at play. And such a tension always brings about another concept, which is called pharmakos. Pharmakos is Greek for scapegoat. So one of these ideas has to go out. So you're scapegoating something. Meat has become a scapegoat. I will come back to this. What I find particularly toxic is that this narrative gets propagated by mass media. You may know or not know that The Guardian has received a substantial amount of money to publish a series called Animals Farmed, which goal is to depict animal agriculture as harmful to humans, the planet, animals, etc. Now, this money is originating from the Open Philanthropy Project, which is also an investor in Impossible Foods, by the way. Last year, we published a study that looked into discourses in the Daily Mail. Now, the Daily Mail is another major British newspaper. And what we have done is analyzing every single article that was published dealing with meat and health during 15 years, so the first 15 years of the century. And we have quantified certain aspects. We also have done discourse analysis. And what we found is that it's not all that much about science, but it is about post-truth, being prone to cherry-picking, invention of facts. So it's not about the facts as such as how you put them together and you create a storyline. And it is also about the attention economy. And that has to do with the way those kind of mass media systems are financed. So they're financed by advertisers, and those advertisers want clickbait. That's how you generate income. So the more attractive you make your headlines, the more money it brings in. So you'll end up with these screaming headlines. This is an example. It's also an example of a pharmacon. This is the British breakfast, the British fry-up. One article in the Daily Mail stated that it's the healthiest breakfast of all, and another one states that it may raise risk of bowel cancer by 63%. So how to confuse your public. And you can say, well, this is the Daily Mail. It's a sensationalist newspaper in the first place. But what we have seen is that it has not always been the case, at least not to the same extent. Now, in the first years of the period, we noticed that the headlines were quite moderate. We've seen as you can see in the graph over there, we've seen an increase in the length of the titles over the years, especially starting after 2005, 2006, and also more sensationalism within those headlines. One of the headlines, for instance, taken from 2006, red meat can raise cancer risk, which I would say is a fair headline. We can discuss about those things, but as a headline, it's pretty much okay. The ones you get at the later stages, well, you see a couple of examples on the right side. If you want to see the other ones, you can find them in my paper. But some of them are really interesting. Just to give an example, why feasting on steak makes it difficult for men to father a child. It makes their sperm slow. Vegetarians have a better sex life, etc., etc. A very interesting one, and that's also the point where we stopped our analysis, was the one from 2015 at the bottom. Let me zoom into this one. Bacon, burgers, and sausages are a cancer risk, say World Health Chiefs. And then they compare processed meats to cigarettes and asbestos. Now, this refers to the IRC WHO report from the World Health Organization. And this is, of course, not what the report is saying, but this is what the Daily Mail made out of it. And what you see here is very important. World Health Chiefs, because this shows you that authority is stepping in. So you will have appeal to authority, which is reinforced, I would say, from 2015 on. It's very hard to argue about the place of red meat and processed meats if you have to face authority. Because people will always refer, yes, but WHO said, and that blocks a lot of the debate. Now, what you can notice is that it's a very strong authority. Well, let me first start to give you this example. This is an example from my home country. Now, Belgium is a complicated country. We have mostly a Flemish-speaking part, which is Flanders, and a French-speaking part in the south, which is Wallonie. In Flanders, we have recently adopted this pyramid. It's an upside-down pyramid for some reason, and you will find meat at the very bottom. They're even below butter. I don't know if they did this on purpose or not, but it's really at the bottom of the pyramid. It's indicated by an orange color, which somehow suggests that something is not well. There's a smiley next to it, which is not all that happy, I would say. So this is clearly trying to marginalize red meat. But what's more interesting is that you have this red circle. And in this red circle, you will find every single derivative of fresh meat. So whatever is processed to some extent, be it the very processed ones, but also things like cooked ham or dry-aged ham or salami, bacon, you name it. It's all in this red circle, which means that you're not supposed to eat it. It's together with crisps, candy, alcohol. It's banned from our diets, according to these guidelines. Now, I didn't agree with this, and I wrote an article together with other scientists explaining why I disagree. So this is peer-reviewed, it's in literature, you can read it, but that's where it stops, because authority says this is truth. And this authoritarian push is getting stronger by the month almost. You may have seen this one. This is the planetary health diet, which is proposed by the Eat Lancet Commission. It is part of what they call the Great Food Transformation. Notice that this is written with capital letters. And this is how it looks like. So it looks pretty fresh and nutritious if you look at the left side of the slide. But if you look in detail, what this diet is saying is that basically you can have more added sugars than you can have any of the animal products. You're allowed to have 7 grams of beef and lamb. Well, you can have 14 if you give up your pork. You can have 1.5 eggs a week. So it's very restrictive with respect to animal foods. You can practically call this semi-vegetarian. You also can find a vegetarian version of this, which is also allowed, or even a vegan one, as long as you supplement with B12. Now, I have many issues with this diet as well. And if you look at it, you really go inside the rabbit hole. I will not go into all those aspects here, but I've written an article about the Eat Lancet Commission's approach. You can find it on EFA News, together with Dr. Martin Cohen. And one of the issues we have is that there is a strong alliance with something called WBCSD through the Fresh Initiative. Now, this brings in allies from all major food multinationals, ingredient companies, fertilizer companies, and so on. And it's interesting to notice that all those companies are pretty much in favor of the anti-livestock narrative. I'll give you an example. PepsiCo's senior director claims the future is vegan. That's an astonishing thing to say. That would not be possible so many years ago. So what has changed? Why is this the case? It is not about any conspiracy kind of theory. It's actually a normal, spontaneous consequence of how the market works. Because those companies have made their model in the previous century, I would say, especially since the 1950s, when they started to offer convenience to the public. It was highly needed. People needed convenience, needed a new food retail system. They offered pleasure, hedonistic pleasure mostly. And that is all well until you reach a certain saturation, because the logic is that you have to keep on growing. You have to please your shareholders every so many months. So you have to indicate growth. But if you saturate, you have to expand. So you go global. Until, again, things start to slow down. And then you would have to find new ways to open markets. Well, you create all kinds of new products, food innovation, and you connect it to lifestyle. There's a lot of lifestyle marketing going on. We've seen many examples of this. And then again, at some point, you need something new. So what if, for the next phase, you have this scenario? You can start from very cheap materials, and you can upgrade them to something that has a lot of added value, high prices. So those things are quite expensive. And the value you create is basically through processing. I would say ultra-processing. And that's what they've been good at. Their whole core system is about generating value through processing for many purposes. But in this case, it's about upgrading cheap materials. You can only do that, of course, if you combine it with substantial storytelling. This sector, on the other hand, is a very difficult one. This was a very profitable model in the past. But nowadays, what you're facing is animal welfare issues, annoying farmers, limited processing, small margins, you name it. So that's something that is starting to look a bit like a difficult one to tackle. You better have this one, a transition, a great food transformation by using bioreactors, technology, high-tech, quick fix kind of things to make a plant-based burger, for instance. But how are you going to sell this? How are you going to fool people into this? Well, you have to promise things. You have to promise purity, health, progress, redemption of all sorts. And create capital. You have to get it up hills. You have to create economic capital, cultural capital, scientific capital. Now, we have been there before. Margarine was created on demand of Napoleon III as a substitute for butter for the lower classes, for the army. And in the 19th century, any imitation of butter would have been looked upon as fraud. It was food fraud. People appreciated the real one. And as you can see here, if you try to sell something that was trying to mimic butter, well, you were into food fraud. And yet, the whole thing has turned around. Multinationals have started to patent the process. Procter & Gamble stepped in with Crisco, and they had a product that initially was meant to make soap, and somehow they redirected it to the food chain. And it worked because it was connected to very important drivers for society, such as progression. It had a very progressive appeal. It was endorsed by feminists. It was new. It was scientific, white coats, laboratories, progress. And it had scientific backup at a certain moment as well, when the saturated fat story came in. So Ansel Keys and so on. I want to show you something on the right. This is an advertisement for margarine, and look at what it says. It looks like, it cooks like, and it tastes like butter. So they admit that it's a substitute, an imitation, and yet it's presented as something positive. This is the Beyond Burger vegan patty. It looks, cooks, and tastes just like beef. There's nothing new there. It's a copy-paste all over again. So if you want to introduce such a, I would say, drastically different diet upon the population. So this is a planetary health diet. This is designed for every single person on the planet. You're not going to just impose this thing. People will not accept it as such. And the authors know that. That's what they state in their report. So the scale of change you would get with this kind of approach is unlikely to be successful if you just leave it to the individual, or as they say, to the whim of the consumer choice. So they have an ally. They have several allies, and one is the World Resources Institute, which has proposed the strategy of the shift wheel, which is based on private marketing tactics. And it includes such elements as disguising the change, creating new markets, new habits, make some foods socially acceptable, others socially unacceptable, constrain display, and many other things. And they offer a range of possible policy interventions, ranging from the soft to the hard, with a couple of examples here. So this is from their report. One is to play with retail and how you expose people to these products. This is, for instance, a supermarket project by Oxford University, funded by the Wellcome Trust, which is also one of the organisms funding the EAT Foundation. That's one thing. But you also have this, which is probably much more effective. It is interfering with nutritional labeling and dietary guidelines. Now, probably the biggest victory for EAT, or what they consider the biggest victory, is the Canadian new guidelines. This is what more or less what you see there. It's very similar to EAT in many respects, and they have also connections with the EAT Foundation. It's currently being debated because the Conservatives apparently have called it biased and driven by ideology. So it will be interesting to see what follows out of that. But these are very striking evolutions. You have the 30-day diet challenge. That's just things such as veganuary, meatless May, and so on. Very concerning is this taxing idea. So this is not about small taxes, it's about substantial taxes. And we're going to tax red meat to save the planet, nothing less. We're going to save the planet by taxing meat because it will prevent so many deaths. And as stated by Professor Willett from Harvard, there on the right, or it will just, it's just the best way, you know, if we abandon meat, it's just going to be the best way to save the planet. So we should all go vegan, preferably by 2050, according to Dr. Springman from Oxford University. So Harvard, Oxford, right? Or ban it altogether. This is from the latest report from C40 cities, where they advance two targets, a progressive target for 2030, which would be to reduce meat consumption per person per year to 16 kilos, and dairy to 90 kilos. And they have also an ambitious target, which states 0 for both meat and dairy. So just get rid of it, ban it. Some other remarkable signals. On top, you find New York's Mayor Bill de Blasio saying to reduce by 50% all beef purchases and to phase out completely all processed meats by 2030. In New York, that will give interesting results. Also to introduce meatless Mondays in public schools. And a very remarkable one is the one by Christiana Figueres, which is the architect of the climate of the Paris agreements. So she's really high level in the United Nations, in the environmental sections. And what she said is the following. How about in about 10 to 15 years in restaurants, we will start treating the meat eaters as the smokers, and they will have to eat the meat out of the restaurant. So we'll ban the meat from the restaurants. That's actually also in the WRI policy spectrum. Remove meat from restaurant menu. Below you find, again, Wellcome Trusts, funding this time an academic who has written a paper where he argues for a legal ban on all animal source foods. So a legal ban, except in some very exceptional situations. So this is the kind of narrative we are facing. And if these are the policies that are being aimed at, we better have some very robust science behind it, I would say, because the consequences will be substantial. So it refers to a combination of environmental ideas and nutritional health-related ideas. You also have animal welfare. I will leave this out of discussion now. Not able to cover everything, but that's also an issue, of course. These three elements are often intertwined. So let's have a look at what that actually means. And let me start by showing this tweet by Professor Mann from, he's director of the Earth System Science Center from Penn State. And he's replying to a tweet of somebody saying that, well, the biggest change you can make, the best thing you can do for climate is to become vegetarian. Or even better, to become vegan. That's in line with all the previous slides, right? That's the common idea. Now, Professor Mann, which is a top leading climate expert, is stating here that's a myth. Meat eating is a modest slice of the carbon emissions pie. The lion's share of carbon emissions comes from fossil fuel burning. So let's look what that means. Let's try to estimate what the impact would be on an individual. Now, that will depend, of course, on the type of individual and what he's exactly doing. So it's not easy to do so. And you also see that somebody in the United States has a very high carbon footprint. People in India, of course, have a much lower footprint. The EU is somewhere in the middle, and then that's the average for the EU. But if you would take something like this, for instance. Let's take 12 tons of CO2 equivalents. That corresponds to the footprint of the average Frenchman. And you can see here the breakdown in different categories corresponding to this footprint. So you have all sorts of things. I also put as a reference here what happens if you avoid a flight, transatlantic within Europe, just to have an idea, or to live without cars, depending on the car you have and how you use it. And then you have the diet part. So you often hear that it's the biggest thing you can do. It will give you a 50% reduction, or I don't know which numbers they're throwing around. But those shifts are to be situated within the diet compartment. That's the thing at the end. So and maybe let's show this once. So what happens if you take out the animal source foods products? You will shift to more plants, and the net effects you will have are shown there. So if you go vegan, you get minus 0.8, vegetarian 0.5, flexitarian, I estimated it here somewhere at 0.3. It will depend a bit, it will shift a bit around, but roughly, these are the numbers you'll be getting. That we're talking about 2 to 6% reductions, which, if you take into account the rebound effects, it would maybe be even half of that. So, regardless of this discussion, basically, what we see is that the switch to the plant diets, will be somewhere between 1 and 6%. So it's not nothing. It changes a bit, but those numbers are very different than what you usually hear stated in media and even by policymakers. So you have to judge them on their true impact. You'll find the same order of magnitude if you look on the macro level. So there's, for instance, this study by White and Hall that shows that a dietary change in the US, throwing out all livestock and moving to plant-based diets, would give a 2.6 difference for the country. 2.6, which globally would mean an effect of something below 0.5% of the emissions. Meatless Mondays would give you 0.3%. And moreover, the authors have modeled in that if you do that, you will end up with certain deficiencies in essential nutrients. So you have an effect, but you also have trade-offs. And that's, at the end, it's normal, because if you look at what livestock is producing within the US, is a contribution of 4% to the emission pie, and transportation, for instance, gives you 29%, electricity 28%, industry. Those things are the substantial contributors. And basically what you see here is that the elephant in the room is fossil fuels. And the narrative is focusing on the meat and on the dairy, but the real thing driving this is fossil fuels. This is for Flanders, so this is the Flemish-speaking region in Belgium. And you see the impact of agriculture. Well, basically in Flanders, there's a single steel factory that produces more emissions than all of the agriculture combined, both plants and animals. This is Brussels Airport as a reference. So what are we doing here? Is this not ending up in using livestock as a scapegoat? Just to put our minds around something that we can handle instead of facing the complexity. Cement, for instance, produces 7% of man-made CO2. Now, if you look at the cement-related emissions during 3 years recently in China, well, that is more than a whole century of US emissions. Global tourism at 8% of the emissions. ICT is climbing. It may reach even 14% by 2040. That's a difficult prediction, but just to give you an idea that things can evolve quickly, especially smartphones. Food waste. Now that's something, fortunately, I can align on with initiatives like Eat Lancet. Absolutely, food waste is a major problem. But pet feed, for instance, pet feed impacts. The contribution of pet feed in the whole emission of animal production is quite substantial. It can be 1/4 or maybe more of the total impact. And the pet part is interesting. We never talk about the pets, but we have indeed more horses than dairy cows in the United States, for instance. And this is a study from Switzerland, where they have seen that having a horse as a pet or as an animal is corresponding with more or less 1/3 of a person's effect on the environment. And what's interesting is that the authors conclude the following. However, when viewed across Switzerland as a whole, keeping pets is not a critical issue. It accounts only for about 1.2% of the total Swiss environmental pollution. And I think that's a fair and balanced statement, but it's not all that much different from the dietary conclusion one should make. And yet it's not treated the same way. So we're not putting all that much emphasis on smartphones and holidays and pets as we do on the diet. And what we do is use slogans and abuse the metrics. And you'll have these kind of conversations, that cows are worse than cars. But what does that even mean? There's several problems with this. Now, I'm going to just focus here a bit, especially on the emissions. I know there are many other issues in animal agriculture, and they all have their different aspects. And I'm not arguing to be specific here also. I'm not arguing that all is fine. I'm not saying that there's nothing to be done and everything is okay. And there's much more, such as water quality, biodiversity. So I will focus on the emissions, because I can cover only so much ground here. But this is a very recurrent one, right? You see that a lot. And that refers to the FAO reports from 2006 and what came later, where they have taken things out of context. They have compared life cycle analysis data with direct emissions, because we know what livestock contributes. It's 14.5% as a life cycle analysis. But we're not sure how that relates to transportation, because we only have the direct emissions. And if you compare the direct emissions, well, livestock is 5% and transport is 14%. So this is already a sign that this slogan is not reflecting reality. But mostly this 14.5% you see is a global number. That's a global reflection. And that masks a lot of heterogeneity. We generally see that industrialized nations are getting increasingly efficient and reducing their emissions. You also see it on the map over there. And you have also these red zones where things are largely suboptimal. Take a country like India. Now, India has a low footprint in general because of the lifestyles. But if you look to the methane emissions, it's the #1 emitter. But they consume less than 1 kilogram of beef per person per year. Has to do also with the fact that, the sacred cows. And there's a lot of potential there for improvement globally. So you very often see that global numbers are applied to local context. And then, of course, livestock emits methane. And everything is lumped together into CO2 equivalents. But methane and CO2 are fundamentally different gases. They behave very differently. The cow will belch methane, it will emit methane, but that methane will be short-lived. It will be converted into CO2. CO2 will enter photosynthesis, will become feed again, and you have a natural carbon cycle. That's very different from fossil fuels, which took millions of years to get there, and now we're taking them in, we're burning them and putting them in the CO2 in the atmosphere. So every single unit of fossil fuel you're burning will contribute to global warming. And that's because CO2 is a stock pollutant, and it's long-lived. It just doesn't disappear quickly. It will stay in the atmosphere for a long time. Methane is a flow pollutant. So that means that if you keep your herds more or less stable, you will not contribute to additional warming. If you're able to decrease methane emissions, you will even have the opposite effect. So that's very, very different, and yet people lump that together into one metric. So we usually tend to simplify things quite a bit. Another point is that in these cases, people assume mostly, also methodologists assume mostly equilibrium with the sequestration, because you will also have carbon sequestered in the soil if you do animal agriculture. So you have sinking in the soil, which, for instance, you can see from the work of Jason Roundtree's group. And below an example from the white oak pastures, where you see that the soil carbon accumulates. You have emissions at the same time, but net in this case, you even have sinking. You have a net carbon balance. So you're actually putting more carbon in the soil than you're emitting in this case. So it all depends on the type of production system you have in place. And this sequestration is often not taken into account. Grasslands are fantastic carbon sinks. They're robust also. In some places like California, you better even sometimes have grassland and forest, because you can have wildfires and the forest will burn and it will all be gone again. These grasslands are much more stable in that respect. Not saying that forests are not good, of course, but it's a sink. It's sinking. And agriculture has its role to play. And the last point, which is a very important one, is that we have to compare on a fair basis. Nutritional quality is crucial. And that's a point raised by Professor Drevnovsky in this paper. And I think it's a very fair point. What he states is that one question is whether the higher emission cost of some foods can be offset by their higher nutritional value. That's a very crucial point. Indeed, things can change a lot if you take into account nutrition. Let's look at this one. This shows you the emissions for different types of foods. And the red bars indicate what happens if you look at grams of a product. The yellow ones show what happens if you look at protein content. And then the green ones show what happens if you take into account limiting essential amino acids. That changes the picture quite a bit. And that is also valid for land use, by the way. Now, of course, you can say we have to mix the different plants to have in a diet. It's never like this, of course, but it shows you that nutrition plays. It's not something you can just neglect. It doesn't mean a lot to say that the emissions per amount of food are so much if this doesn't bring you any nutritional value, or even per kilocal, which you see mostly. And even if you talk about protein, it's about protein quality. And essential amino acids are one thing, but you also have digestibility, for instance. Depending on the calculation for protein quality, you will see the effects will change. And the newest metrics that take into account the true ileal digestibility give you a different view on protein quality. Some claims you can make on plant protein sources no longer seem that robust if you take into account those metrics. So protein quality is very, very important. And let's not forget that the global challenges, because this is what it's about now, it's about facing the global challenges. The global challenge here is nutrient-dense food. It's adequate, essential nutrition. It is not kilocalories. It is not the amount of food. It's not the carbohydrates even. It's protein, good protein. It's about micronutrients, iron, vitamin D, vitamin B12, zinc, folate, those kind of things. That's what we have to supply, and that's why we need quality food. And you need to do this contextualization for about everything. And there are harmful practices, but there are also beneficial practices. And everything is always lumped together. This is, for instance, water use. Yes, there can be a problem with water and livestock, as it can be the case for plant production. But it's not going to help if you're going to say that 1 kilogram of meat needs 15,000 liters of water. That's just meaningless. That's, again, lumping everything together in one metric. And it just overlooks the fact that there is a fundamental difference between rainfall, green water, and extractive water. Those are different categories. The rainfall will take place anyway. And a cow is not an expanding fat. It's an entirely different story. And you can say, okay, maybe the land, you could use the land for something else, but not all land is just interexchangeable. You cannot grow crops on a lot of land that is used for livestock. Marginal land is a real thing. And if you make more careful evaluations, I do life cycle analysis, which has been done in some Australian studies, well, you will find that under such kind of systems, you will have something like 500 to 500 liters of kilogram of beef, depending on the place you're looking at. So it can vary a bit, but it's more or less in the same order of magnitude as you would have with cereal. So you can have lots of plants that require a lot of extractive water. And yet, what you see that the disinformation is still, or the simplistic messages at least, keep on spreading. This is again from the World Resources Institute. And the title you see on this figure, I had to read it a couple of times to be sure that this was, that I was reading well, because what they're stating here is that beef is an inefficient source of calories and protein. Beef being an inefficient source of protein. I found that an incredible statement. And that is, of course, because they express it, you see it on top, as the units of edible output per units of feed input. So you get so much output, but you care about the nutrition in the first place, on the amount of feed input, but these cows are eating grass. So cows are actually a fantastic upcycler of material that is not edible to humans, and they make quality protein out of that. Or this one. This is showing different foods, and you can see from this that beef is again the villain, because it's the worst for land use, it's the worst for the emissions, and then if you look at what's having a low impact, you will find sugar, palm oil, rice, those kind of things. So you can make your own conclusions. This is not about nutrition, this is about distorting the picture. We talked about this one, this is about the water use. You see beef again at the bottom with a large green bar. The green bar is the rainfall water, it's the green water, right? The blue ones are is the blue water, the extracted water, irrigation and those things. So I would have rather see this ordered according to the blue bars. You would have a different conclusion. So again, not all is well with the environment, and again, things can be changed and need to be changed with livestock, but please let's do it based on the evidence. And what Eat Lancet suggests is just not in tune with the evidence. And they have been pressured into that by, amongst others, Professor Mittler from UC Davis, who was asking information, why are you claiming all these environmental things, and the report doesn't show everything. And he was putting pressure until at some point the science director sent him an email, and he stated the following. I quote, "Finally, the meat consumption limits proposed by the Commission were not set due to environmental considerations, but were solely in light of health recommendations. The dietary guidelines only refer to healthy eating, although the diet is presented as one that will save the planet." That's not how they communicate in public. And with respect to the nutrition, well, it suffices here at this point to say that people were quickly to come out to show that the diet is nutritionally deficient on some points. And Professor Ioannidis from Stanford equated this diet to science fiction, literally. That's his hard quote. So let's take our distances here for a second. What I show here is a group of Siberian nomads, children, and that's what they're eating. Now, if anybody in the West would eat this and ask a dietitian if he's doing okay, you would get, I think, strong reactions. But that's their ancestral food. So are we going to step in there and say that they're eating unhealthy? We're talking about a food that we have been consuming since over 2.6 million of years, and which, according to Professor Dominguez Rodrigo from Complutense University in Madrid, here quoted in an article in Nature, that by at least 1.5 million years ago was so much essential to us, we had become so much adapted to it, that without it, we would die. We wouldn't have been here today. We were depending on it. And so should we tell those people that they have to change their diet? Well, actually, they changed their diet, and now signs of obesity are developing. They have switched to the global food. And that's very similar to what happened to the Inuit. The Inuit have adopted Western-style eating, Western-style behavior as well, such as smoking, etc. and developed all kinds of chronic diseases, cardiometabolic diseases. So the Western mindset steps in and says, you people are eating the wrong way. This is not healthy eating. We will guide you. We will bring you to the healthy diets with this fantastic model. This is a food pyramid designed for Inuit, for the Nunavik region. And it's an igloo kind of pyramid. And you will have several layers. Now, the bottom layer is fruits and vegetables. And if you look well, you will see things like watermelons, bananas, oranges, and those kind of foods. The next layer, it represents grains, breakfast cereals, bread, those kind of foods. And don't forget, we're talking about the Arctic Circle. Then comes milk and alternatives. And then at the top of the pyramid, you will find the actual traditional diet, which is meat, fish, and alternatives. So the whole model is presented as something traditional. That's what Eat Lancet is doing. It's presented as something that can adapt, it's flexible, it's additional. But basically, this is a unified, centralized, monolithic model, sometimes presented as the Mediterranean diet, although it has nothing to do with the Mediterranean diversity in diets. And it's a dangerous approach, I would say. The best antidote to expose such Western-centric approaches to food and diet and health and nutrition is to learn from anthropology. Anthropology is the best way to put things in perspective by looking at different cultures. So let's see a bit how much animal-sourced foods are contributing to the average intake in the US diet. It's about 30%. You see here how it's more or less divided. If you look at ancestral diet systems from hunter-gatherers, you'll find this, an average of 68%. And you will see that this has a lot of variability. Some populations will eat almost nothing else than animal source food. We have seen examples in the previous slides. Others will have more plants. Depends on the region where you live, depends on the ecosystem. There's no vegan community there, but there are some that eat a lot of plants. So it all depends. Something is not adding up. We do see that red meat keeps on decreasing. This is data on the left for Australia. Beef and lamb going down, but poultry going up. So people say people keep on eating more and more meat, but that's because poultry is increasing. It's not about the red meat. At the same time, the chronic diseases are just expanding. On the right, you have data for the US. The red line is beef, and it goes up to a certain point, and then so when the dietary goals are introduced, it starts going down because advice says you shouldn't touch it all that much, so it goes down. And they're almost back at the level of the beginning of the 20th century. And pork hasn't moved all that much. What has increased is the poultry. And at the same time, you see diabetes keeps on increasing. So it's of course dangerous to suggest that these correlations are causal, but at least it should make you think that something is bizarre. So is this nutritional dogma that is usually the one that is underpinning this kind of narrative still robust enough? Because science is moving on. Is this something we should still rely on? We know at present that inflammation and not cholesterol is the cause of chronic disease. This is an interesting paper that has looked at various studies that explore chronic disease and at the same time also look at insulin levels. And what they see is that all those different diseases, they very often, in most cases here, are also a matter of hyperinsulinemia. So it's about insulin resistance, it's about hormone disruptions, it's about your body becoming dysfunctional. That's what's going on. And at present, it's estimated that only 12% of the Americans are still metabolically healthy. Most are diabetic, pre-diabetic, inflamed, and really having bodies that have to be considered as broken machines. So as you see here, what you have this reinforcing system of excess body fat, visceral fat, insulin resistance, chronic inflammation. It will shift your risk factors and it will end up in disease. And it's induced by diet. And the diet inducing this is clearly the Western diet. The question is, to which degree does meat have to play a role in this? How strong is the evidence? Well, the evidence is mostly observational. And observational epidemiology starts from food frequency questionnaires, which are already problematic to begin with, because they suffer from all kinds of problems. People filling in questionnaires and having to report on their dietary behavior. Well, there are several reasons to assume why that is problematic. One of them is healthy user bias. People don't like to report that they eat a lot of red meat because they've been told it's bad and they don't feel comfortable with reporting that, so you get a distortion. And people that do eat a lot of meat usually are also not the most healthy people. We have very strong confounding factors here. Heavy meat eaters in Western settings are usually also having higher body fat, waist circumference, lower education levels, more physical inactivity, more smoking, more alcohol, lower quality diets, unhealthy behavior in general. And you can try to correct for a couple of those things, and epidemiologists usually do, correct for smoking, obesity, and so on, but they cannot correct for every single lifestyle factor. And of course, people that are health conscious, which have been told so many decades that meat is unhealthy, they will not eat a lot of meat. And you see that this whole data set is likely to suffer from a lot of confounding and bias. And despite of all that, what comes out of this are still very weak associations. We're talking about relative risks of below 1.2. They're so weak that you cannot rule out that they're not due to bias. And they would not be considered as strong evidence by clinical epidemiologists. Somehow in nutrition it seems to be the case, but take that to another level and you will have serious debates about the causal interpretations of this. You need much stronger relationships, and you do have those. On the left, you see the relative risk of elevated visceral fat. That's about 6 times the risk for colon cancer. Meat eating will be something like 1.18. So that's a very different order of magnitude. On the left, you have a serious problem. On the right, you don't even know what you're talking about. And interestingly, if you take those studies out of the Western settings and you do them somewhere elsewhere, you see that those associations change. So how can it be if it wouldn't be for the context? And if you go globally, as has been done in the pure studies, if you look at the whole planet and the different diets, well, what they find is that the relationship between dairy and meat is a beneficial one for heart health and longevity. Now, this is, again, epidemiology, and you have to take it with a careful approach. But it's very striking that it becomes a contradictory statement here. Now, it's very difficult, of course, to substantiate causality because you would have to do intervention studies. And that's difficult. It's just difficult. You can look at certain markers. And even if you do that, if you look at the markers for oxidation, inflammation, by feeding substantial amounts of meat, well, you don't see harm. There's nothing there to worry about, really. As the authors of this paper are stating, it's inconsistent with what you see in observational evidence. We don't see any negative things going on here. And as is the case for the sustainability issue, you have this overstating of effects or the use of metrics in a way that just makes seem everything much worse. This one is a typical one. Processed meats will give you 18% risk. That sounds impressive. 18%, I better start thinking about it. But what does this mean? It means that this is a relative risk. So if you have a population that doesn't need a lot of processed meats, you have a certain incidence of bowel cancer. Now, if you increase the risk, this 18%, well, you have another incidence of bowel cancer. But that translates in an absolute risk difference of 1%. Or to put it otherwise, if the association would be causal in the first place, then the absolute risk that one will not develop colorectal cancer during a lifetime would shift from 94% to 93%. That's a whole different way of looking at it. And intuitively, it makes you understand the whole risk much better. Because the human mind thinks in very specific ways. All too often it's assumed that all these things are consensus. Now, even within the IRC WHO panel, consensus was debatable because this is Dave Clurford from USDA, and he has been very, very critical about the whole approach. He doesn't agree with most of what happened. And this is the opinion of Gordon Guyatt from McMaster University. Now, Professor Guyatt is not just anybody. He is at the basis of the grade system, which judges quality for epidemiological evidence. And what he has said is that this approach is profoundly misleading. It has not done the public a service. It has done the public a disservice. You need a certain relative risk of substance to be able to conclude all those things. Because what IRC is doing, by the way, is not talking about risks, it's talking about hazards. So they have identified red meat as a hazard. Now a hazard, for instance, could be a shark. But swimming with sharks is a risk. It's all about the context. Sunlight is a hazard. It's category 1, like processed meats. And yes, it can be harmful, but it can also be beneficial. It is actually beneficial, very much so. It brings you vitamin D and so many other things. But the context matters quite a bit. So you would need, to go from hazard to risk, you need risk assessment. The IRC has not done a risk assessment. They have identified a hazard. And these authors have actually done a risk assessment. And what they conclude is that, at least with respect to heme and red meat, there's not sufficient documentation here to go to that conclusion if you take the context of a normal diet. If you do the actual risk assessment, which takes into account context and complexity. So some authors have started to doubt that if, and ask questions if this IRC approach is useful in the first place. What does it help us to identify hazard and communicate excessively about the hazards if we're not taking into account the risks? Doesn't it only lead to health scares, unnecessary economic costs, loss of beneficial products, greater health costs, and diversion of public funds? So it's indeed on the table. Why are we even talking about food in this kind of way? Is that helpful in the first place? And people hardly read what the actual reports are stating. This is from the WHO website, and I quote there, "Eating red meat has not yet been established as a cause of cancer." Now, they have concerns, I'm not denying that, they are concerned, but they admit that it's not a clear causal relationship yet. And as IRC itself states, chance bias and confounding could not be ruled out, and a couple of other things. So before making those very hard policy interventions, well, we better be sure that we have substantial data and good data to be able to do that. Almost getting there. This is a slide where I more or less show a very reductionist, I agree, overview of the human diet. So ancestral foods mostly, the evolutionary diet has mostly been a mix of all kinds of meats and fish and eggs, and as well as plant foods. And depending on the place you were living, you would have more or less of the plant input, so that was variable. And then you would have the Neolithic change, where you would bring in dairy, you bring in cereals, and those things may not be suitable for everybody to the same extent, because you have lactose intolerance or gluten sensitivity. If you're insulin resistant, you may have some issue. So that depends a bit on the person, but it's still traditional food that offers nutrition. And then you have this thing on top, the contemporary additions. That's what's new. That's what entered when things started to deteriorate. So why is it that we are drawing this line for both health and the environment? What's the idea about this? How can it be that this line would perfectly reflect everything that is wrong with health and our planet and even with animal welfare, if it's not a symbolic line or an ideological line? Because there are things to be said from both sides, so both sides of the divide. There are things that need to be optimized on the animal side, and there are things that need to be optimized on the plant side. Now we could talk about so many things. Avocados in Chile, cashew nuts in India, you name it. Monocultures, soil depleting, chemical fertilizers, many things need to be optimized within the food chain. So let's not focus on this binary division. That will not be helpful. That will actually be harmful, because it will distract us from the from the root cause. What we should do is cut there. That would actually make much more sense. Now, there's a reason why we draw this line, and that would be an entirely different debate. I've just done a podcast this afternoon talking about why people construct this line. It has to do with our relationship with food and the way humans just behave, the needs that humans have, both biological and socially, and how this whole approach to food recently has been turned upside down. Now, the whole physiological basis seems suddenly much more relevant, at least we think so. And we overemphasize the symbolic, individual lifestyle kind of approaches. That's where we have our attention on. And we forget about the communities, we forget about the biology, and the whole thing becomes wobbly, a bit like the Flemish food pyramid. And in this symbolic order, you also have this clear moral crisis, which has to do with how we have been disconnected from food production, how we have lost touch with reality. There are several things I could elaborate on here, but I'm happy to do it maybe after the talk. It would lead us too far. But we need also to think about how humans deal with food. It's not only about the nutrients, it's not only about fueling our bodies, it's going so much further. And if we don't fix that, we will not fix the rest either. So let me conclude with this. I would say that yes, we are facing a public health crisis. I'm not denying this here. I'm not denying that food causes a threat to our planet, and that there is, of course, a serious threat to our planet from many other things as well. This is urgent. This is important, and I'm worried about it. And I do not argue for status quo. I argue for change, but I want to emphasize that I advocate for the use of the best possible evidence, and not narratives, no binary categories, no moral categories, but the best possible scientific evidence. I also argue for more respect. I think we should start respecting the food chain. And that includes the animals, but it also includes the farmers, which are often portrayed as the villains. But those are the people that provide us with food. They allow us to be here today because we don't have to worry about where our food comes from. They deliver it. So more respect, and I'm not, again, they're not all, they're making their own livelihoods, and of course it's their profession and it's how they generate their income, but it's not an easy job, and I think that they deserve to be approached with more respect, to have a sound basis to move towards new policies and include them in the policies, in the policy making. We should refrain from scapegoating, because it's dangerous, it diverts focus, and it takes away our attention from the actual two main priorities, which are ultra-processed foods, the whole snacking culture, everything that goes with that, and fossil fuels. Those are the things that we have to focus on urgently, and we get a bit our science back on the table. So I'll stop here and thank you very much.